The First World War started as the result of a conspiracy. But to understand this conspiracy, we must turn not to Sarajevo and the conclave of Serbian nationalists plotting their assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the summer of 1914, but to a chilly drawing room in London in the winter of 1891.
Rhodes had the money and he had the contact. He was a great Rothschild man, and his mining wealth was literally uncountable.
The will contains the goal, and then by the time he dies in 1902, there's funding, there's a plan, there's an agenda, there's working groups.
The only thing feasible to carry out this idea is a secret society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world.
And they thought if they could hook in with that alliance, then they had the possibility of defeating Germany quickly and without too much trouble. And that is basically what they did.
It is to this clique, not to the doings of any conspiracy in Sarajevo, that we can attribute the real origins of the First World War, with the 9 million dead soldiers and 7 million dead civilians that lay piled in its wake. Carnage the likes of which the world had never seen before had been fully unleashed. The trenches and the shelling, the no man's land and the rivers of blood, the starvation and the destruction, the carving up of empires, and the eradication of an entire generation of young men. Why? What was it all for? What did it accomplish? What was the point? To this day, over 100 years later, we still look back on the horrors of that great war with confusion. For so long we have been told non-answers about incompetent generals and ignorant politicians. It's the senselessness of war, the teachers of this fraudulent and partial history have told us with a shrug. But, now that the players who worked to set the stage for this carnage have been unmasked, these questions can finally be answered.
1914 war das Jahr, in dem der Erste Weltkrieg ausbrach. Es sind einige in meinem Alter hier, die sich noch daran erinnern werden. Nun, dieser Krieg wurde auf der einen Seite von Großbritannien, Frankreich und Russland und auf der anderen Seite von Deutschland, Österreich, Ungarn und der Türkei geführt. Was hat sich dazu getragen? Innerhalb von 2 Jahren gewann Deutschland diesen Krieg nicht nur nominell, sondern tatsächlich. Und dennoch bot Deutschland England den Frieden an. Einen Frieden auf einer Basis, den Anwälte den Status quo ante nennen würden. Das bedeutet, lasst uns den Krieg beenden und lasst alles so sein, wie es war, bevor der Krieg begann. England dachte im Sommer 1916 ernsthaft darüber nach. Tatsächlich hatten sie keine Wahl. Entweder sie würden dieses Friedensangebot annehmen oder bis zur Selbstvernichtung weiterkämpfen. Während dieser Phase wandten sich deutsche Zionisten, die die Zionisten Osteuropas repräsentierten, an das britische Kriegskabinett. Sie sagten, seht her, ihr könnt diesen Krieg noch gewinnen. Ihr müsst nicht aufgeben. Ihr müsst diesen Frieden nicht annehmen, den euch die Deutschen angeboten haben. Ihr könnt diesen Krieg noch gewinnen mit den USA als euren Verbündeten. Die USA hatten mit diesem Krieg noch nichts zu tun. Wir waren frisch, wir waren jung, wir waren reich und wir waren mächtig. Die Zionisten sagten zu England, wir garantieren, dass wir die USA in den Krieg führen als euren Verbündeten, sodass sie an eurer Seite kämpfen werden. Wenn ihr uns Palästina gebt, nachdem ihr den Krieg gewonnen habt. Mit anderen Worten machten sie Folgendes. Wir führen die USA in den Krieg als euren Verbündeten. Den Preis, den ihr zu zahlen habt, ist Palästina, nachdem ihr den Krieg gewonnen habt und Deutschland, Österreich, Ungarn und die Türkei besiegt worden sind. Nun, England hatte das gleiche Recht, irgendjemanden Palästina zu versprechen. Wie, als wenn die USA den Iren Japan versprechen würden, aus welchen Gründen auch immer. Es war absolut absurd, dass Großbritannien, das keine Verbindungen oder Interessen und auch sonst keine Rechte zu dem Gebiet hatte, welches als Palästina bekannt ist. Dieses Land als Zahlungsmittel einzusetzen, um die Zionisten dafür zu bezahlen, dass diese die USA zum Kriegseintritt bewegen würden, wie auch immer. Sie gaben dieses Versprechen im Oktober 1916. Oktober 1916. Und kurz danach, ich weiß nicht, wie viele sich noch daran erinnern werden, traten die USA, die bis dahin immer absolut pro-deutsch waren. Ich sage, die USA waren bis dahin immer pro-deutsch, weil die Zeitungen unter jüdischer Kontrolle waren, die Bankiers waren Juden, die Massenmedien in diesem Land waren unter jüdischer Kontrolle. Und die Juden selbst waren pro-deutsch. Weil viele von ihnen aus Deutschland kamen, sie wollten, dass Deutschland den Zar besiegt. Die Juden hassten den Zar. Sie wollten nicht, dass Russland den Krieg gewinnt. Diese deutsch-jüdischen Banker wie Kuhn-Loeb und andere Großbanken der USA weigerten sich, England und Frankreich auch nur mit $1 zu unterstützen. Sie sagten, solange England und Frankreich Verbündete Russlands sind, gibt es nicht einen Cent. Aber sie pumpten Geld nach Deutschland. Sie kämpften mit Deutschland gegen Russland, um das zaristische Regime zu brechen. Nun, dieselben Juden, als sie die Möglichkeit sahen, Palästina zu bekommen, schlossen den Vertrag mit England ab. Ab diesem Moment änderte sich alles wie bei einer Ampel, die von Rot auf Grün schaltet. Alle Zeitungen, die den Menschen erzählten, wie schwer es doch die Deutschen im Kampf gegen die Briten hatten, änderten plötzlich ihre Meinung. Sie erzählten, die Deutschen wären schlecht, sie wären wie die Hunnen, wie Barbaren. Sie, die Deutschen, würden Rotkreuzschwestern erschießen und kleinen Babys die Hände abschneiden. Sie wären einfach schlecht. Nun und kurz danach erklärte Mr. Wilson Deutschland den Krieg. Die Zionisten in London telegrafierten in die USA zu Richter Brandeis mit der Aufforderung, gehen Sie zu Präsident Wilson und bearbeiten Sie ihn. Wir bekommen von England, was wir wollen. Bringen Sie Präsident Wilson dazu, in den Krieg einzutreten. So sollte es dann auch kommen. Auf diese Art und Weise traten die USA in den Krieg ein. Wir hatten kein Interesse daran. Wir wurden hineingetrieben in diesen Krieg, nur damit die Zionisten dieser Welt ihr Palästina bekommen. Nun, das ist etwas, was den Bürgern dieses Landes niemals erzählt wurde. Sie haben nie gewusst, warum wir in den Ersten Weltkrieg eintraten. Gingen die Zionisten nach Großbritannien und sagten, nun, wir haben unseren Teil der Abmachung erfüllt, gebt uns ein Schriftstück, das uns zeigt, dass wir Palästina bekommen, nachdem ihr den Krieg gewonnen habt. Sie wussten auch gar nicht, wie lange der Krieg dauern würde, ob 1, 2 oder 10 Jahre, aber sie fertigten es an. Das Schriftstück wurde in Form eines Briefes in einer eigenartigen Ausdrucksform geschrieben, sodass die Welt nicht genau wissen würde, was dahinter steckt. Dieses Schriftstück hieß die Balfour Deklaration. Die Balfour Deklaration war nichts anderes als die Rechnung an England, die Zionisten für das abgemachte Geschäft zu bezahlen. Diese große Balfour-Deklaration ist genauso wertvoll wie eine 3-Dollar-Note. Ich denke, ich kann mich nicht anders ausdrücken. So begann der ganze Ärger.
The Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words. Dear Lord Rothschild.
Money is the god of our time, and Rothschild is his prophet. Heinrich Heine. The mythology surrounding the Rothschilds' wealth and power is 2 centuries old. The resulting mythology has proved almost as long-lived as the firm of N.M. Rothschild and Sons itself. Ever since the second decade of the 19th century, there has been speculation about the origins and extent of the family's wealth, about their political influence, not only in the 5 countries where there were Rothschild houses, but throughout the world, about their Judaism. The 5 Rothschild houses constitute an early version of what later became known as the multinational. Perhaps the most important point to grasp about this multinational partnership is that for most of the century between 1815 and 1914, it was easily the biggest bank in the world. Strictly in terms of their combined capital, the Rothschilds were in a league of their own until, at the earliest, the 1880s. The 20th century has no equivalent. Because they were so rich, the Rothschilds could plainly claim a material equivalence with the European aristocracy. They relished the sense that they were sans pareil. In this sense, phrases like kings of the Jews, which contemporaries applied to them, contained an important element of truth. That was exactly the way the Rothschilds saw and conducted themselves. There are numerous apocryphal business maxims attributed to the Rothschilds. For example, to hold 1/3 of one's wealth in securities, 1/3 in real estate, and 1/3 in jewels and artworks. To treat the stock exchange like a cold shower, quick in, quick out, or to leave the last 10% to someone else. The economic history of capitalism is therefore incomplete until some attempt has been made to explain how the Rothschilds became so phenomenally rich. All 19th century states ran budget deficits, and some almost always did. And it was war and the preparation for war which generally precipitated the biggest increases in expenditure. For it was by lending to governments or by speculating in existing government bonds that the Rothschilds made a very large part of their colossal fortune. The answer lies in the way these investments were carried out. Only a few years previously, Meyer-Amschel had been arranging payments of some 620,000 gulden from the Elector to Austria to pay for troops and horses in the 1809 campaign against France. Shortly after Meyer-Amschel's death, his son Amschel was advancing 255,000 gulden to purchase horses for the French army. He simply backed both sides. Such a strategy has obvious attractions, and it was to become a frequent Rothschild gambit in the decades ahead. Amschel was only half joking when he wrote, urging Solomon, "Do your stuff. Make the Frankfurt house richer by 1,000,000 francs, the Paris house richer by 1,000,000 louis d'or, and the London house richer by 1,000,000 pounds, and you'll be awarded the Order of the Grande Armée." Such transactions probably accounted for the lion's share of the profits the Rothschilds made in this decisive period. By now, the markets were tending to follow the Rothschild lead. As Karl noted, "When we buy, everybody buys." This reflected the widespread belief that the Rothschilds were acting on behalf of the English government, and that this was being done in order to force the rate of the pound sterling up, and that we succeeded very well in doing so.
You'll lend to the goyim.
Okay, I don't know that word.
Okay. And you won't borrow. You'll lend them the money. You rule over the goyim. Yeah.
In 1961, biographer Frederick Morton wrote of the House of Rothschild that they had conquered the world more thoroughly, more cunningly, and much more lastingly than all the Caesars before. But the Rothschilds were not the first to practice the 2 great evils of banking, fractional reserve lending and encouraging a national debt. 900 years ago, goldsmiths served as the first bankers in England because they had large, secure vaults where they stored their gold as well as the gold of others. Most people simply left their gold in the goldsmith's vault, and the goldsmith wrote out paper receipts for their gold. Soon, people started trading these receipts as money. However, the goldsmiths soon learned two very important ways to abuse their new system. First of all, they discovered that on average, only about 10% of the depositors actually wanted their gold back at any one time. So if they were dishonest, they could print 10 paper receipts for every 1 ounce of gold in their vault. Then they could lend these extra receipts out to people. What a scam! So if they were lending out at 6% per year, their profit wouldn't just be 6% per year, it would really be 10 times that, or 60% per year. In reality, this is called fractional reserve lending, but it was nothing but counterfeiting. But fractional reserve lending not only made the goldsmiths rich, it gave them control over the quantity of money in the entire economy. What good was that? By acting in concert with other goldsmiths, if they refused to lend out their gold receipts and call in their old loans, it caused a depression. The second thing the goldsmiths learned was that if they could get the king to borrow from them, then soon the king would become dependent on these loans being renewed time and time again. Once the king was dependent on new loans, the goldsmiths could make sure that no new laws would ever be passed which would harm their counterfeiting business, the most lucrative business in the history of humanity.
Just think of it, a system where some people, because they have a special license to do it, can lend the same money 5, 10, 15, or 20 times to that many different people or companies or governments and collect interest on it from each one of them. Well, this is just grand larceny.
Human nature is to take any loan offered. In the case of politicians, the attraction is clear. If a politician can borrow, they will spend more on their constituents without having to raise their taxes and thereby get reelected. That's why government borrowing is the most dangerous force on the planet. Dangerous to human freedom, that is.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And I've had very good relationships with presidents.
Today's Fed is nothing but a private monopoly over the nation's money. It pretends to be able to control how much money banks create out of nothing as loans. But as we found out during the 2008 congressional hearings, instead of lending out only 10 times as much money as they actually had, the biggest banks were lending out 50 times as much or more. Why haven't we heard this before? Why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't the root of our economic problems taught in every classroom around the world? Because the three major pathways of truthfully informing the public have been blocked by those who make money off the debt money system. There is now no penalty for a politician selling his soul to bankers. The vast majority of President Obama's top campaign contributors were the biggest banks. The same goes for the Republican nominee in 2012, Mitt Romney. So we need a new crop of politicians who will tell us the truth about how money is created and in whose benefit.
So when it comes to the national debt, you would not have had a national debt if we'd not given the power to create money to the banking sector. You need to take that power to create money back to a public body. So you don't give that power to politicians because they'll abuse it in the same way that the banks have done.
Yesterday, a judge approved the settlement with SAC Capital, a $602 million fine for civil insider trading. One asks whether $602 million fine is likely to have much effect. Of course, that the owner and CEO of SEC Capital, took home last year in compensation $1.4 billion personally. So I checked what Stephen A. Cohen, his political engagement this past year, and he gave $217,000 in campaign contributions. Now, this is a pittance from the point of view of his wealth, obviously, as a share of $1.4 billion paycheck. But $217,000 with our cheapskate politicians actually goes a long way to making sure that Mr. Cohen will be very well treated by his senators and by others who are giving ample protection. The financial markets are the #1 campaign contributors in the U.S. system now. We have a corrupt politics to the core, I'm afraid to say. The final point, of course, is separating the politicians from the crooks. But maybe that's so close together that they can't actually be separated. Maybe it's just the same community.
What happens is that ultimately the one who creates money controls the political structure. So if you let the bank to create money for the nation, so over time you would find the bank will be ultimately controlling the resources and the political structure or power in the country.
Seems strange that that community will stand for that when, with a bit of political will, it could issue its own debt-free money supply.
So how about the economics academic community in the United States? Surely professors of economics have their academic freedom, the continual search for the truth, protected by what's called tenure. Tenure is where a professor can't be fired for their political opinions.
Tenure started around 1900 and worked well for the first 70 years or so. But by the mid-1990s, things had changed. In order to hide the upcoming failings of the old debt money system, the Federal Reserve began a substantial program of consultants, visiting scholars, alumni, and staff economists that today so thoroughly dominates the field of economics that real criticism of the central bank and its debt money system has become a career liability, or when it comes to a reputable economics journal, an impossibility. At the prestigious Journal of Monetary Economics, more than half of the editorial board members are currently on the Fed payroll, and the rest have been in the past. The Fed's Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. employs 220 PhD economists. The 12 regional banks employ scores more. Roger Auerbach, a former investigator with the House Banking Committee, found out that there are only 1,000 to 1,500 monetary economists working in the U.S. today. In 2009, the last year figures were available, the Fed spent $433 million on experts researching monetary and economic policy. If that isn't bad enough, the Fed has all the pathways to all the major economics journals blocked as well. In a recent survey of the 7 top journals, 84 of the 190 editorial board members were affiliated with the Federal Reserve in one way or another. According to Joshua Rosner, a Wall Street analyst who correctly called the 2008 meltdown,
the Fed has a lock on the economics world. There is no room for other views. The only way you can actually get in a journal is by subscribing to the views of one of the journals.
But it's not all about the money either. When you are an up-and-coming economist trying to gain tenure at a university, the prestige of being associated with the Fed in one way or another is an absolute necessity. According to Jane Darista, a Fed critic and an economist with the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst,
it's very important, if you are on a tenure track and don't have tenure, to show that you are valued by the Federal Reserve.
Academics that do research, warning of a banking crisis, get told, well, we may have to fire you because our funding was cut by 80% and professors' jobs aren't safe. You have to change your research or we can't have you anymore at the university. And that's quite shocking, isn't it?
There is a reluctance or even a denial that there is a problem with the monetary system. And it's at the time it's only a few academic experts who are willing to concede that there might be some problem with the money system.
So what is the media message? What is the media telling the public? The media tells the public that the problem is that the government is printing too much money. You hear it over and over every day on the news. But it's not. It would not be nearly so bad if that was really the problem.
We aren't printing money. We are borrowing every dollar into existence. And worse, borrowing it at interest.
So isn't the media supposed to be the keepers of the public interest, the fourth estate? Not anymore. Here's a story I was told a couple of years ago. When I released my last documentary, The Secret of Oz, at the end of 2009, I sent it to two friends of mine in the media. They worked at one of the big three U.S. networks. One was the president of the network, and the other, my oldest friend in the media business, was his executive producer. After viewing the film, they called me and said, "This is great." I was puzzled. I'd expected that they would dismiss it as some sort of economic conspiracy theory. But they told me that they had just been laid off with 100 other network executives because of J.P. Morgan. I asked what J.P. Morgan had to do with the network, and they said that the networks are so heavily in debt to Morgan that every time loans come due, J.P. Morgan efficiency experts make demands on what the network has to do to have its loans renewed. What would be the price for non-compliance? The network would be out of business in a single week. So it's just like the average American homeowner. They are all mortgaged to the max to banks. Anything the bank says, they have to do. Just as the Bible says in Proverbs.
Just as the rich rule over the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender.
So do you really have to ask why the general public is confused? If our politicians can't tell us the truth, and the media can't dare to tell us the truth, then even the professors can't tell us the truth. What is the average person supposed to believe, and how can they ever discover the truth, much less sort it out from the conflicting diversions?
What I found, though, when you talk about things like monetary policy, economic policies, yes, you can state the truth, the public will understand it, but you'll immediately get an official expert come out and say, oh, it's not so simple. It's more complex than that. And clearly there seems to be this belief among economists that a complex theory, lots of abstract mathematics, because it must be cleverer, is intellectually superior to a simple argument. The truth couldn't be further from it, because it's a fundamental principle in logic known to Aristotle and William of Ockham, who said, very truthfully, that a simple argument beats a complex argument.
So what do we do about this? Fortunately, the solution is easy to understand, and it's basically the same for every nation on earth. All monetary reformers agree that fractional reserve lending is nothing but outright theft and must be stopped. Some believe that no interest is justified at all, that all interest is usury and has been condemned for centuries by both the Christian and Muslim faiths.
The Quran uses the term riba for what Western people would have understood as usury, except that sometimes the definition of usury would be exorbitant usury, and that there was an acceptable amount of usury that would not be condemned, but not in Islam.
I cannot see why the banking sector should have the privilege of creating money and the government being forced to borrow from the banks at interest.
Remember, the bank isn't actually loaning real money. It is simply adding some numbers to an account. In exchange, the borrower agrees to repay this loan with compounding interest. But where does the interest money come from? Well, you either have to take it from someone else, reducing their ability to service their interest-bearing loans, or you have to take out another loan to repay your existing loan. In other words, this system creates a global Ponzi scheme based on ever-increasing levels of debt.
As to the German experience of hyperinflation in the early 20s, it's not true that was caused by the government, because the government had no say at all in monetary policy at the time. That was actually an Allied Commission, and the people who had the say in that commission were private bankers, particularly from the United Kingdom and from the United States. And the government had no say in it. So this is a myth.
Here's my axiom. It matters not what backs the money. All that matters is who controls the quantity. Will you be in control of the quantity in the public interest, or will you give that power up again to bankers who will, by definition, have to maximize profits for their corporation?
The German army suffered terribly during the First World War. And the German nation also suffered terribly, especially after the war. The crippling sanctions enacted by the victors with the Treaty of Versailles threw the country into serious depression. There was chaos on the streets and anarchy in the air. Communists seized many cities, including Berlin. While the great wealth of the nation was bled away by outrageous war reparations or sucked out by unscrupulous politicians, the average German was impoverished. Inflation and unemployment soon followed and quickly destroyed all hope, all confidence, all morality. German cities were awash in pornography and prostitution, with even starving children being bought and sold like sex toys. Crime was rampant. Drunkenness and drug addiction were widespread. Suicide rates soared. The situation seemed hopeless. And then things changed, dramatically. Soon after the National Socialists were elected, the German economy sprang to life. Unemployment was erased. Building boomed. Great projects began. Confidence burst to life anew. After years of hunger, hardship, shame, and degradation, Germany became a happy, hopeful nation again. Germany's transformation from squalor and misery to a world superpower was so incredible that the 1938 Time magazine named Adolf Hitler Man of the Year. To many, it seemed as if a new cultural, economic, and political renaissance for all of Europe was at hand. But others throughout the world, envious, powerful, but above all fearful, now worked night and day to take Germany down. The Second World War was the most deadly and destructive war in history. For 6 long years, the unequal struggle pitting Germany against the world continued, with first one side, then the other on top. But at last, overwhelmed, Germany was once more defeated. This time, however, the Reich was to be punished not with mere reparations, nor loss of land, nor with simple decadence and despair. No. On this occasion, Germany was to be subjected to pure hatred. Hatred of the most vicious, evil, and depraved kind imaginable. Millions upon millions of Germans, many of whom had nothing to do with the war, were systematically raped, tortured, slaughtered, and all in the most sadistic and sickening ways imaginable. What happened to Germany and its people during and after World War II has remained the darkest and best kept secret in world history.
The U.S. State Department, in its 3-volume report on the origins of communism in Russia, published in 1931, reveals how Jewish-controlled German banks under the leadership of Max Warburg conspired as early as 1914 to send large payments to Lenin, Trotsky, and others in their attempts to bring down the Tsar. When the White Russian patriots heroically attempted to regain their freedom from the Jews, the Judaica says compact Jewish masses were utilized by the Bolsheviks to suppress such counter-revolutions. Clearly, Jews and native Russians were engaged in a death struggle over the destiny of Russia. Unfortunately, the Jewish masses won. The Jewish masses won. The Jewish masses won.
היטלר טוען בספר שלו שהיהודים הם קומוניסטים. הם עשו את המהפכה ברוסיה. הם הרגו שם 30 מיליון רוסים, את כל האינטליגנציה, בצורה אכזרית ונוראה. ואת זה הם רוצים לעשות לכל העולם. הארץ הבאה בתור זה גרמניה. הם הקימו את המפלגה הקומוניסטית והסוציאליסטית הגרמנית, וזה נכון. אם אנחנו לא נתגבר אליהם עכשיו, הם יחסלו אותנו וישחטו גם כאן 20 מיליון איש את כל האינטליגנציה. וככה הם הלכו מארץ לארץ. כשבסופו של דבר האינטליגנטים היחידים, החכמים היחידים, יהיו רק היהודים. והוא חוזר על זה הרבה פעמים, שלא תהיה טעות. והוא צודק. את המהפכה ברוסיה עשו היהודים.
Russia in the spring of 1917 was a powder keg waiting to explode. And in April of that year, 2 matches, one called Vladimir Lenin and one called Leon Trotsky, were thrown directly into that powder keg by both sides of the Great War. Vladimir Lenin, a Russian communist revolutionary who had been living in political exile in Switzerland, saw in the February Revolution his chance to push through a Marxist revolution in his homeland. But although for the first time in decades his return to that homeland was politically possible, the war made the journey itself an impossibility. Famously, he was able to broker a deal with the German General Staff to allow Lenin and dozens of other revolutionaries to cross through Germany on their way to Petrograd. Germany's reasoning in permitting the infamous SEAL train ride of Lenin and his compatriots is, as a matter of war strategy, straightforward. If a band of revolutionaries could get back to Russia and bog down the provisional government, then the German army, fighting that government, would benefit. If the revolutionaries actually came to power and took Russia out of the war altogether, so much the better. But the curious other side of this story, the one demonstrating how Lenin's fellow communist revolutionary, Leon Trotsky, was shepherded from New York, where he had been living well beyond the means of his income as a writer for socialist periodicals, through Canada, where he was stopped and identified as a revolutionary en route to Russia, and on to Petrograd, is altogether more incredible. And, unsurprisingly, that story is mostly avoided by historians of the First World War. One of the scholars who did not shy away from the story was Anthony Sutton, author of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, whose meticulous research of State Department documents, Canadian government records, and other historical artifacts pieced together the details of Trotsky's unlikely journey.
Trotsky was in New York. He had no income. I summed his income for the year he was in New York. It was about $600. Yet he lived in an apartment. He had a chauffeured limousine. He had a refrigerator, which was very rare in those days. He left New York and went to Canada on his way to the revolution. He had $10,000 in gold on him. He didn't earn more than $600 in New York. He was financed out of New York. There's no question about that. The British took him off the ship in Halifax, Canada. I got the Canadian archives. They knew who he was. They knew who Trotsky was. They knew he was going to start a revolution in Russia. Instructions from London came to put Trotsky back on the boat with his party and allow them to go forward. So there is no question that Woodrow Wilson, who issued the passport for Trotsky, and the New York financiers who financed Trotsky, and the British Foreign Office allowed Trotsky to perform his part in the revolution.
After succeeding in pushing through the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917, one of Trotsky's first acts in his new position as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs was to publish the secret treaties and understandings that Russia had signed with France and Britain. These documents revealed the secret negotiations in which the Entente powers had agreed to carve up the colonial world after the war. The stash of documents included agreements on the partition of Asiatic Turkey, creating the modern Middle East out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, the treaty with Italy, promising conquered territory to the Italian government in exchange for their military aid in the campaign against Austria-Hungary, a treaty redrawing the frontiers of Germany, promising France its long-held wish of reacquiring Alsace-Lorraine and recognizing Russia's complete liberty in establishing her western frontiers, diplomatic documents relating to Japan's own territorial aspirations, and a host of other treaties, agreements, and negotiations. One of these agreements, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, which was signed in May 1916, has grown in infamy over the decades. The agreement divided modern-day Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon among the Triple Entente, and although the revelation of the agreement caused much embarrassment for the British and the French and forced them to publicly back away from the Sykes-Picot map, served as the basis for some of the arbitrary lines on the map of the modern-day Middle East, including the border between Syria and Iraq. In recent years, ISIS has claimed that part of their mission is to put the final nail in the coffin of the Sykes-Picot conspiracy.
Hands tied behind the back, an expertly aimed shot in the neck, and the fall into a huge mass grave. These people were not killed by the Nazis. They were killed by one of the Allies, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was killing people in this way for many years, both before and after it joined the Allies. These victims had no memorials. They were buried in anonymous mass graves. The murderer's power that killed them, and the powers that collaborated with the murderer, were never actually prepared to talk about them. The memory of millions of innocent victims was erased from history. Youth throughout the world likes to make jokes using popular symbols of the past. While the Nazi swastika is considered to be a bad joke, Soviet symbols are not. Communism, after all, was not Nazism. It was about equality and harmony. There was nothing wrong with the idea itself. Well, actually, there was. There was something which made it different from the other utopias. Lenin believed in what he called the war of classes, which meant that the ultimate harmony can only be reached after certain groups of people are killed. Hang at least 100 kulaks, execute the hostages, do it in such a way that people for hundreds of miles around will see and tremble. Lenin. In 1917, the communists seized power. Lenin now had a chance to apply Marxism to real life.
Those who resisted were shot. There were terrible massacres against resisting peasants. And again, nobody knows exactly how many people died, but we're talking about 10 million or more.
But even the most ruthless terror could not break popular resistance, particularly in the ethnic republics, where communist terror was entwined with national oppression, as it was in Ukraine. On September the 11th, 1932, Stalin wrote to his associate Kaganovich, "The situation in Ukraine is very bad. If we don't take steps now, we may lose Ukraine." Several meetings of Stalin's inner circle resulted in a plan of action. It was an horrific plan.
In that winter, 32 to 33, all food supplies in the Ukraine were taken away. A huge cordon was created so that nobody could leave.
Initially, people didn't die. Leftover supplies of grain and vegetables kept them alive. But this was not part of Stalin's plan.
So he ordered NKVD to confiscate all grain, all food from these areas. By doing that, he knew he's condemning them to death.
Ukrainians were dying torturously slowly. Children cried agonizingly for bread. Many lost their sense of fear. They went to the NKVD-guarded fields to collect single ears of grain. They were shot on the spot. Stalin rarely signed execution orders alone. The other Politburo members also had to put their signatures on the death lists. Even those who later condemned Stalin were responsible for mass murder themselves. Comrades were united by common crimes. There was no way back for them, but to commit new crimes. Mass murder in Katyn unleashed the industrial killing, which will soon turn World War II into the most bloody carnage in human history. After Katyn, the Soviets carried out massacres on a regular basis. Riga, Tartu, Lviv, Minsk. Relatives could not identify many of the corpses. Horrific torture had made them unrecognizable. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had become an allied power. The Soviet officers who pulled out fingernails, cut tongues, and perforated the skulls of their victims with nails were paid with Western aid. The British War Crimes Act gives them immunity from persecution in Britain, because war crimes, by definition, were committed only by the Germans.
You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
1933. And that was the year in November when Franklin Roosevelt, then in his very first term, recognized the Soviet Union, normalized relations. Well, this was already underway. We already had the infiltration beginning, Soviet-directed, a Communist Party directed. And what I discovered at a certain point in my research was that in order to perpetuate this alliance, to continue relations with the Soviet Union, which became really an obsession of American governments from that day forward, the American government had to learn to lie to the people and tell us lies about communism, tell us lies about Stalin, tell us lies about the Soviet Union.
Malcolm Muggeridge arrived in the USSR in 1932. He was one of the very few journalists to report on the real conditions in the countryside. For every article on the famine that appeared, 2 were published denying its existence. Muggeridge recalls the most influential correspondent in Moscow was Walter Duranty, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times.
not only the greatest liar among the journalists in Moscow, but he was the greatest liar of any journalist that I've ever met in the 50 years of journalism. And we used to wonder whether, in fact, the authorities hadn't got some kind of hold over him, because he so utterly played their game. When it came to the famine, the great famine in Ukraine, that was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine.
The Soviets actually grant Duranty permission to tour Ukraine unchaperoned. He reports in the Times that all talk of famine now is ridiculous. Yet documents from the British Foreign Office reveal that in private conversations at the British Embassy, Duranty said as many as 10 million people had died.
When they were discussing the question of recognizing the Soviet Union, the United States government recognizing the Soviet Union, the articles of Duranty were considered as very valuable evidence on the side of recognition.
And I think in some way, this is where we see the rise of double standards. I think we also see the rise eventually of moral relativism, cultural relativism. These ills that we see in our culture today, I think, have their roots in this relationship. And so I would begin but with this very beginning, because I think it was that important. November 16, 1933, the day we recognized the Soviet Union. This was very strange given the record of the Bolshevik government coming in terms of body count. In those early revolutionary years, the Soviet, the new Bolshevik secret police, executed without trial more than 1,000 people per month. Later in the 1930s, Stalin was killing tens of thousands of people per month. And yet the United States rushed into alliance, rushed to recognize the Soviet government under Roosevelt. During World War II, rushed into this alliance. We later learned, confirmed, after archives opened on the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, we later learned many of these senior officials in the United States government were working for Stalin. They were Soviet agents.
In Roosevelt's day, it was Soviet agents Harry Dexter White and Henry Morgenthau, Harry Hopkins, Lachlan Curry, Algy Hiss, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, Frank Coe, Shlomo Adler, and too many more to mention, which was in fact just about the entire Roosevelt war cabinet. Then we might add you had Roosevelt's wife, who was a lesbian and pen friend of arch-communist Anna Louise Strong, who died in China, besties to the end with Mao. Don't worry, nothing to see here.
The two basic areas of interest to look at in Churchill's career are the period when he was in the so-called wilderness, when he resigned from Stanley Baldwin's cabinet as a minister, and for the next 10 years until 1939 he was out of office, out of any office at all. He was just a member of Parliament. So all he had was his salary as a member of Parliament and his rather pitiful earnings as a journalist, and yet somehow he managed to support an enormous country estate, which cost a very large sum of money to support, with all the gardeners and the nurseries and the nurses and the nannies and the cooks and the housekeepers and all the rest of it. He had a private staff of sometimes 20 or 30 people, all supported on his salary as a member of Parliament, which was at that time £500 per annum, $750 a year, or $2,000 actually, because at that time I think it was $4 to the pound. How did he do it? Well, the answer is that from 1936 onwards he was financed by a little secret pressure group called The Focus. You won't find much reference to The Focus in the history books, but it certainly existed, and there are several files of Churchill's private papers relating to The Focus. The Focus was a group of perhaps 30 or 40 leading British industrialists and bankers and former politicians who decided that Churchill was worth keeping afloat, and they funded him. They weren't all Jews. They were primarily Jewish, but there were also left-wing socialists and left-wing conservative members of Parliament who all decided to keep him afloat. In July 1936, the then chairman of the of the Shell Petroleum Company wrote out a cheque for Churchill of the order of £40,000, which in modern day money would be probably about $700,000, and gave it to him as a gift. He was Jewish. It was a Jewish gift to Churchill, and the intention was that Churchill, they bought him. He became the Pied Piper from that moment on. And the one who pays the piper calls the tune. If you look at the events as they really happened, until 1936, he hardly gave Germany a passing mention in his speeches and writings. Other things were more important. From 1936 onwards, he began beating the anti-Nazi, anti-German drum. And at that time, there was a great deal of pro-German sentiment in Britain, as witnessed the behavior of the Duke of Windsor, the King. King Edward VIII, who ruled for just less than a year after the death of his father, was very pro-German and pro-Hitler, and actually got on very well with Adolf Hitler when he visited Germany later in 1937. He was forced to abdicate by the same lobby, but it was this lobby which was financing Churchill from 1936 onwards, and which finally maneuvered and engineered his introduction into the cabinet in 1939, and finally his taking over as Prime Minister in 1940. He fought a war that Britain had no real interest in. And I've repeatedly said this. Any logical perception of World War II now, looking back after 50 years, screams to the high heavens. And we can see quite clearly that we should have said to the Poles in 1939, you've got a problem with the Germans, sort it out yourself. We should have said to the Jews, you've got a problem with the Nazis, sort it out yourself. It's no concern of Britain and the British Empire. We've got other fish to fry. That's what we should have said. Churchill, unfortunately, was beholden to these people, and he had no alternative. So in 1940, when we had a choice put to us of accepting the very generous peace offer that was put to us, which has been concealed from the history books by the Germans, or of fighting a totally senseless war onwards, Churchill took the wrong turning and bankrupted Britain and ruined the British Empire. In 1941, just to end this, it becomes very interesting indeed, because the Weizmann papers, which are the papers of Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the State of Israel, and he was the leader of the international Zionist movement throughout World War II. The Weizmann archives, foolishly or wisely, gave me complete access to all the Weizmann correspondence with Churchill. And in the Weizmann archives, all Churchill's correspondence with Weizmann throughout the war years and before the war, and all his notes on his meetings with Churchill. And I'm only going to mention one of those letters here. It's a letter written by Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement, at that time living in the United States, to Winston Churchill in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, when Churchill is frantically trying to claw the United States into his war, because that's his only salvation. And Weizmann writes to Churchill a letter which he says, Mr. Prime Minister, unless you grant us what we want, which is the creation of a Jewish army in the Middle East, with our own arsenal and our own weapons and our own uniform and our own flag, unless you grant us what we want, then you are not going to win us over. And let me tell you what we will do if you do grant us what we want. If you grant us our wishes, then we will act on your behalf in the United States. And remember, Mr. Churchill, he writes in this letter, remember, we are the only powerful, unified bloc in the United States which solidly backs the British cause in this war. September 1941. Everybody else is basically isolationist. We are the only ethnic, unified group which solidly backs the British cause. We are the only people who are in the position to bring the United States into this war. We did it in the last war, and we can do it again.
Because of the high interest that the Jews charged people was so high, it ruined, it destroyed the economy in Germany. They destroyed, just like they destroyed Russia. A few years before that, through their communism over there, Jews destroyed Russia. Not Goyim. Jews destroyed. Communism is by Jews. Well, don't let anybody confuse you. You look at history, Karl Marx, all the other Reshaim, they're all Jews. Wicked, but nonetheless Jews. They destroyed Russia, and he wrote in chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, they destroyed Russia, now they're destroying Germany, that's why I have to destroy them. Now, this doesn't make he's right. The point is, that's actually real, true history. Now, he saw that the Jews are controlling the financial system and they're charging such high interest, they destroyed the German economy to the extent that by the time you arrived to go to the store to buy bread, you had to take a whole horse carriage full of money. By the time you arrived at the store, it wasn't enough. Why? Because the inflation rate was so high. The bread became so much more valuable and your money went down. So now he says, what's the cause of this? Because nobody could afford to do anything because the interest rates are so high. So he decided no more interest rates. You're not allowed to charge interest rates. And at that time, the Great Depression was happening around the entire world. Everyone was in a financial collapse. America was a financial collapse. England was a financial collapse. Everybody else was collapsing. Germany collapsed worse than everybody else. But after he passed this law of no more interest, within 6 years, Germany became the leading, wealthiest economy in the world. They called it a financial miracle. Why? They were the only ones that were bold enough to stop interest.
So what we know about Adolf Hitler is like what we know about history. The victors, of course, write the history, don't they? They write the history, and they tell us a narrative, and we're supposed to swallow that bullshit as if it's true. The major crime of Adolf Hitler was that he got Germany out of a banking debt that was drowning the German people in a cesspool of moral decay, drowning in debt. And he had the nerve to actually say fuck off to the bankers and start printing their own money. And Germany went from a destitute post-World War country that was drowning, Germans starving, no jobs, nothing. And he got them out of that debt and literally brought that nation back to a powerhouse within several years just by using their own money supply. That's the real crime that Adolf Hitler committed. Now, I could sit here and talk and really excite the senses a little bit more about everything we've been taught about World War II and the Holocaust, but let it suffice to say that it fits in line with virtually everything we've been told about history in general. Bullshit. Bullshit. And John F. Kennedy had the courage and the balls and integrity to bypass the Federal Reserve Bank, to bypass this financial system, and he was dead within 6 months. And there ain't no coincidence there. Definitely not. We only need to do one thing to turn it all around. One thing. Let's confront that financial system. Let us print our own money.
Geheime Verhandlungen zwischen den Nazis und den Zionisten im Jahre 1933, die es den deutschen Juden und ihrem Vermögen erlaubten, nach Palästina zu gehen. Zum gleichen Zeitpunkt handelte eine Gruppe von Juden ein stilles Abkommen mit den Nazis aus, um die Immigration der deutschen Juden und die Überweisung des jüdischen Vermögens nach Palästina zu ermöglichen. Laut Bericht von 1933 wurde dieses Abkommen das Transferabkommen genannt. Palästina, damals dünn besiedelt von Juden, veränderte sich im Ergebnis radikal. Ich habe in Palästina von 1933 bis 1936 gelebt. Wir sahen jede Woche Reisepässe von deutschen Juden. Sie kamen, um sich in Palästina anzusiedeln. Deutsch-jüdische Besiedlung Palästinas war eine Zeit lang offizielle Nazi-Politik. Diese Fotos des jüdischen Lebens in Palästina erscheinen zusammen mit einem längeren Text im Jahre 1934 in der Berliner Zeitung Der Angriff, deren Verleger Hitlers Propagandaminister Josef Goebbels war. Ein Nazi-Besuch in Palästina war der Teil der mehrteiligen Serie. Goebbels ließ zum Gedenken eine Münze anfertigen. Auf der einen Seite das Hakenkreuz, auf der anderen Seite den Davidstern. Hitler verlangte nur eine Gegenleistung für das Aussiedlungsabkommen, und zwar, dass der jüdische Boykott des Reichs von Juden in Deutschland und anderswo sofort von den Zionisten aufgehoben wird. Die Zionisten nahmen die Konzession an. London, England, das Transferabkommen, auch das Havar Avara-Abkommen genannt. Das Transferabkommen war ein Pakt, der den Juden die Auswanderung von Deutschland nach Palästina ermöglichte, ohne ihr Vermögen zu verlieren. Dies steht im Widerspruch zu jeglicher Anti-Hitler-Propaganda. Der Vertrag wurde im August 1933 abgeschlossen, nach Gesprächen zwischen deutschen Beamten und dem palästinensischen Zentrum der Zionistischen Weltorganisation. Der Jude, der nach Palästina wollte, zahlte Geld auf ein Sonderkonto in Deutschland ein. Die Mittel wurden verwendet, um deutsche Waren zu kaufen, die nach Palästina exportiert wurden und dort durch die jüdische Havara-Kompanie in Tel Aviv verkauft wurden. Gewinne aus dem Verkauf wurden dann den jüdischen Immigranten nach ihrer Ankunft gegeben, ein Betrag entsprechend der ersten Einzahlung in Deutschland. So diente das Abkommen dem zionistischen Ziel, jüdische Siedler und Entwicklungspotenzial nach Palästina zu bringen, bei gleichzeitiger Förderung des deutschen Zieles der Befreiung des Landes von einer unerwünschten fremden Gruppe. Als Ergebnis unterstützte Hitlers Regierung tatkräftig die Auswanderung der Juden nach Palästina von 1933 bis 1940-41, als der Ausbruch des Zweiten Weltkrieges eine weitere Zusammenarbeit verhinderte. Bis 1934 schwelte der Konflikt zwischen Deutschland und Polen. Danzig neben Ostpreußen war völlig vom Reich abgeschnitten. Warschau versuchte weiterhin die Kontrolle über die strategisch wichtige Hafenstadt zu erlangen. In Westpreußen sah die Lage ähnlich aus. Ostpreußen war nun völlig vom Deutschen Reich abgeschnitten. Unterstützt von englischen und französischen Hilfsgarantien im Falle eines Krieges hat Polen keinen guten Grund mehr, in gutem Glauben mit Deutschland zu verhandeln, und in der Zwischenzeit zirkulierten in Warschau Landkarten, die eine neue polnische Grenze im Westen zeigten, die sich bis zum Westen Berlins ausbreitete. In ganz Polen beginnen die sogenannten Pogrome gegen die Minderheiten. Nacht für Nacht schossen polnische Grenzbeamte auf fliehende Deutsche. Kurz vor dem offiziellen Kriegsausbruch waren schon 80.000 ethnische Deutsche in Flüchtlingslagern in Danzig und auch im Deutschen Reich untergebracht. Das Leiden der deutschen Minderheit in Polen hatte sich nun zum dritten und dringendsten Grund, der zum Ausbruch des Krieges führen würde, entwickelt. Die demokratischen Staaten sollten nicht zu eitel sein und glauben, dass dieser Zustand ewig dauern wird. Adolf Hitler, 1939. Die Danzig-Massaker. Hitler hat nun das Problem, dass England und Frankreich ihn den Krieg erklären werden. Zu diesem Zeitpunkt werden in Polen schwere Grausamkeiten gegen die deutsche Minderheit in Westpreußen begangen, im deutschen Teil von Polen. Aufgrund der Tatsache, dass die Polen Gräueltaten an der deutschen Minderheit verüben, ist Hitler nun in einer sehr schwierigen Situation. Im Grunde genommen ist es so, wenn ich den Polen nicht den Krieg erkläre und diesen Deutschen nicht zur Hilfe komme, dann werden die deutschen Minderheiten weiterhin abgeschlachtet. Und es war nicht eine unbedeutende Anzahl von Deutschen, die in diesem Gebiet getötet wurden. Ich meine, es war wirklich entsetzlich, was geschah und was die Polen in dem Gebiet taten. Und so sagte er im Grunde, nun, wenn wir nicht eingreifen, werden diese Deutschen weiterhin abgeschlachtet. Wenn wir eingreifen, werden wir uns im Krieg mit Polen, Frankreich, England und möglicherweise mit der Sowjetunion befinden. Aber mit einem brillanten Schachzug verblüfft er im Sommer 1939 die ganze Welt, als er ein Bündnis mit Stalin schließt. Mit Stalin auf seiner Seite war Hitler sich sicher, dass kein anderer eingreifen würde, wenn er die Polen angriff. Während die Militärkommissionen der westlichen Mächte noch in Moskau verhandelten, ob Russland in die Front gegen Deutschland angeworben werden sollte, Reichsaußenminister von Ribbentrop fliegt in die sowjetische Hauptstadt, um einen Nichtangriffspakt zu unterzeichnen und sich mit Stalin und dem Außenkommissar Molotow zu beraten.
Es sind Dinge, die ich als Soldat des Weltkrieges, der ich nur im Westen gekämpft habe, nie kennenzulernen Gelegenheit hatte. Tausende von niedergemetzelten Volksdeutschen, viehisch abgeschlachteten Frauen, Mädchen und Kindern. Unzählige deutsche Soldaten und Offiziere, die als Verwundete in die Hände dieses Gegners gefallen sind. Sie wurden massakriert, Augen ausgestochen, bestialisch verstümmelt. Und das Schlimmste, diese polnische Regierung hat das in ihrem eigenen Rundfunk ganz offen zugegeben. Dass abspringende Soldaten der Luftwaffe ermordet worden sind und so weiter. Es gab wirklich Momente, da man sich sagen musste, soll man unter diesen Umständen sich selbst noch irgendeine Beschränkung auferlegen? Es ist mir nicht bekannt geworden, dass irgendeiner unserer demokratischen Staatsmänner es der Mühe wert gefunden hat, gegen diese Barbareien zu protestieren. Ich habe der deutschen Luftwaffe den Auftrag gegeben, dass sie diesen Krieg human führt. Das heißt, dass sie nur gegen kämpfende Truppen führt. Die polnische Regierung und Heeresleitung gab ihren zivilen Menschen den Auftrag, dass sie diesen Krieg führen als Heckenschützen aus dem Hinterhalt. Es war sehr schwer, sich hier in der Gewalt zu behalten. Ich möchte aber hier gleich betonen, man soll sich auch hier wieder nicht in den demokratischen Staaten einbilden, dass das ewig so sein muss. Wenn man es anders haben will, dann kann man es auch anders haben. Ein polnischer Marschall, der jetzt jammervoll seine Armee im Stich gelassen hat, er erklärt, dass er Deutschland und die deutschen Armeen zerhacken werde. Und parallel damit setzt ein Martyrium ein für unsere Volksdeutschen. Zehntausende werden verschleppt, misshandelt, in der grausamsten Weise getötet. Sadistische Bestien lassen ihre perversen Instinkte aus und diese demokratische, fromme Welt sieht zu, ohne mit einer Wimper zu zucken. Ich habe mir oft die Frage vorgelegt, wer kann Polen so verblendet haben? Glaubte man wirklich, dass die deutsche Nation sich auf die Dauer von einem so lächerlichen Staat sich das bieten lassen würde? Glaubte man das wirklich?
Mit Applaus wird der Führer begrüßt, der in diesem Augenblick im Opernhaus eingetroffen ist, um zum Reichstag zu reden, der zu einer außerordentlichen Sitzung zusammengerufen worden ist.
War und ist eine deutsche Stadt.
Danzig war und ist eine deutsche Stadt. Alle diese Gebiete verdanken ihre kulturelle Erschließung ausschließlich dem deutschen Volk.
Wenn Polen versuchen sollte, auf dem Weg zollpolitischer Maßnahmen Danzig wirtschaftlich zu vernichten, dass dann Deutschland nicht mehr länger untätig zusehen könnte.
Ich habe dem polnischen Botschafter mitteilen lassen, vor nun schon über 3 Wochen, dass wenn Polen noch weitere Unterdrückungsmaßnahmen gegen das dortige Deutschtum vornehmen würde oder versuchen sollte, Danzig wirtschaftlich zu vernichten, dass dann Deutschland nicht mehr länger untätig zusehen könnte. Wir unterbrechen die Sendung von Adolf Hitlers Rede kurzfristig, um über eine Nachricht aus Paris zu berichten, die besagt, dass der französische Premier Daladier den französischen Ministerrat zu einer Dringlichkeitssitzung einberufen hat.
Ich habe mich daher nun entschlossen, mit Polen in der gleichen Sprache zu reden, mit der Polen und der Polen.
Ich habe mich daher nun entschlossen, mit Polen in der gleichen Sprache zu reden, mit der Polen nun seit Monaten mit uns spricht. Polnische Truppen werden mobilisiert.
Das Russland in Deutschland von 2 verschiedenen Doktrinen regiert werden. Es war nur eine Frage.
Danzig wird noch am gleichen Tag befreit. Wir unterbrechen erneut die Rede von Reichskanzler Hitler, um Ihnen mitzuteilen, dass das Parlament in London zu einem Treffen um 18 Uhr einberufen wurde.
Zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen.
Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten.
Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten. Polen hat die deutsche Wehrmacht schwer unterschätzt. Die Taktik, den Feind mit hoher Geschwindigkeit anzugreifen, auch bekannt als Blitzkrieg, ist absolut verheerend. Die Lage der deutschen Minderheit war klar geworden. In den Wochen vor dem Ausbruch des Krieges spielte eine Rassenpropaganda der polnischen Presse eine große Rolle bei der Verfolgung der bereits gejagten und belästigten Deutschen. Gewalttätige Aktionen gegen Deutsche hielten an und es wurden 58.000 abgeschlachtet. Die schlimmsten Massaker werden zwischen dem 31. August und dem 6. September stattfinden. Der Höhepunkt ist der 3. September in Bromberg, der heute als Blutiger Sonntag bekannt ist. Die Massenmorde wurden erst am 18. September mit dem Eintreffen von deutschen Truppen nahe Lowicz beendet. Diejenigen, die für schuldig befunden wurden, an den brutalen Morden teilgehabt zu haben, sahen nun ihren Tod durch ein Erschießungskommando ins Angesicht. London, England, 3. September 1939. Ich spreche zu Ihnen vom Kabinettraum in der Downing Street Nummer 10. Der britische Botschafter in Berlin überreichte heute Morgen eine letzte Nachricht an die deutsche Regierung, die besagt, dass, wenn wir bis 11 Uhr nicht von Ihnen gehört haben, dass sie sofort mit der Vorbereitung des Rückzugs aller ihrer Truppen aus Polen beginnen, dass dann ein Kriegszustand zwischen uns existieren würde. Ich muss Ihnen nun mitteilen, dass darauf nicht eingegangen worden ist und dass folglich dieses Land nun im Krieg mit Deutschland ist.
Ich war allerdings vorher sehr traurig. Denn ich habe ja alles getan, um den Krieg zu vermeiden. In diesen Tagen, da hat Sven Hedin ein Buch herausgegeben, in dem er dankenswerterweise mein damals den Engländern übermitteltes Angebot für die Polen wortwörtlich nun zitiert. Ich muss sagen, ich habe eigentlich ein Frösteln gefühlt, als ich nun dieses Angebot wieder durchgelesen habe. Dank auch aus dem, was ich seitdem nun weiß, denn wenn damals dieses Angebot angenommen worden wäre, dann wäre wohl Danzig Deutsch, aber im Übrigen wäre alles beim Alten geblieben. Wir hätten uns unseren sozialen Aufgaben gewidmet, wir hätten gearbeitet, wir hätten unsere Städte verschönt, wir hätten Wohnkolonien gebaut, wir hätten unsere Straßen in Ordnung gebracht, wir hätten Schulen eingerichtet, wir hätten einen richtigen nationalsozialistischen Staat aufgebaut. Und nun ist der Kampf gekommen. Ich habe auch hier alles getan, was ein Mensch überhaupt tun konnte, fast zur Selbstentwürdigung, um es zu vermeiden. Ich habe den Engländern Angebot gemacht. Ich habe mit ihren Diplomaten hier gesprochen und habe sie beschworen, sie möchten doch Vernunft annehmen. Aber es war nicht zu wollen, sie wollten den Krieg und sie haben auch gar keinen Hehl gemacht. Seit 7 Jahren erklärt Mr. Churchill, ich will keinen Krieg. Ich habe das bedauert, dass Völker gegeneinander kämpfen müssen, die ich so gerne zusammenführen wollte. Führer Adolf Hitler, warum dürfen wir nicht zurückschlagen? Warum müssen wir uns das bieten lassen? Ich musste jahrelang sie immer wieder zwingen, legal zu sein. Und so ist es auch heute. Ich muss manches Mal monatelang irgendwo zusehen. Glauben Sie nur nicht, dass mir nicht das Herz vom Grimm zerfressen wird, wenn ich von diesen Luftangriffen höre. Sie wissen, ich habe monatelang das nicht getan. Ich habe auf Paris nicht eine Bombe in die Stadt werfen lassen. Ich habe, bevor wir Warschau angriffen, 5-mal die Aufforderung gerichtet nach Ergebung. Es wurde alles abgelehnt. Ich habe gebeten, man soll dann die Frauen und die Kinder wenigstens rausschicken. Nicht einmal der Parlamentär wurde empfangen. Es wurde alles abgelehnt. Und erst dann habe ich mich entschlossen, das zu tun, was nach jedem Kriegsrecht statthaft ist. Als die Engländer mit ihren Bombenwürfen anfingen, da habe ich 3,5 Monate gewartet und habe nichts getan. Wir waren schon stark genug, es zu tun. Ich habe gewartet, bin in der Meinung, es würde vielleicht doch die Vernunft zurückkehren. Es kam anders. Glauben Sie, heute ist es nicht anders. Und nun, meine Volksgenossen, die Opfer. Sie sind für den Einzelnen sehr schwer. Die Frau, die ihren Mann verloren hat, sie hat das Höchste verloren, was sie besitzt. Und das Kind, das den Vater verlor, desgleichen. Und die Mutter, die ihr Kind opferte. Oder auch die Frau oder die Geliebte, die den ihren ziehen ließen und ihn nimmer mehr sehen. Die haben alle ein großes Opfer gebracht.
Es möge sich jeder Deutsche dessen bewusst sein, dass das Opfer dieser Männer genauso viel wert war, als das Opfer jedes anderen in der Zukunft wert sein wird. Was die Frau an Opfern auf sich nimmt, indem sie der Nation das Kind schenkt, nimmt der Mann an Opfern auf sich, indem er die Nation verteidigt. Für unser deutsches Volk sind im Laufe von vielen Jahrhunderten, ja Jahrtausenden, zahllose Millionen gefallen. Millionen andere haben ihr Blut dafür gegeben.
General Otto Ernst Rehmer in einer Konversation mit Adolf Hitler. 1944 fragte General Otto Ernst Rehmer, verantwortlicher Kommandant für die Verteidigung der Wolfsschanze, den Führer, ob er mit der Invasion hinsichtlich Polen nicht noch hätte warten können. Hitler antwortete: Sie irren sich. Ich wusste seit März 1939, dass Roosevelt beschlossen hatte, einen Weltkrieg herbeizuführen, und ich wusste, dass die Briten mit ihm zusammenarbeiteten und dass Churchill beteiligt war. Gott weiß, dass ich sicherlich keinen Weltkrieg wollte. Deshalb habe ich versucht, das polnische Problem auf meine Weise zu lösen, mit einer Art Strafexpedition ohne eine Kriegserklärung. Immerhin hatte es Tausende von Morden an Aussiedlern und 1,2 Millionen volksdeutschen Flüchtlingen gegeben. Was hätte ich tun sollen? Ich musste handeln. Und aus diesem Grund habe ich 4 Wochen nach diesem Feldzug das großzügigste Friedensangebot gemacht, das jemals ein siegreicher Führer gemacht hatte. Leider war es nicht erfolgreich. Wenn ich im Hinblick auf die polnische Frage nicht gehandelt hätte, wie ich handelte, um einen Zweiten Weltkrieg zu verhindern, dann hätten wir spätestens 1942 das erlebt, was wir jetzt im Jahre 1944 erleben. Wir besiegten den falschen Feind. Nach dem Krieg gab der Kommandant der 3. US-Armee, General George S. Patton, öffentlich zu, dass die Alliierten gegen das falsche Volk gekämpft hatten. Er sagte über die Sowjets: Lassen Sie uns ihnen keine Zeit geben, ihren Nachschub aufzubauen. Falls wir das tun, dann haben wir über die Deutschen gesiegt und sie entwaffnet, aber sind bei der Befreiung von Europa gescheitert. Wir haben den Krieg verloren. Er schrieb an seine Frau: Wenn wir gegen sie kämpfen müssen, dann ist jetzt der richtige Zeitpunkt. Von nun an werden wir immer schwächer und sie stärker. Die Medien fingen nun damit an, eine Kampagne zu starten, um General Patton in Misskredit zu bringen. Patton am 22. September 1945. Es gibt einen sehr deutlichen semitischen Einfluss in der Presse. Sie versuchen 2 Dinge zu tun. Erstens die Umsetzung des Kommunismus und zweitens, dass alle Geschäftsleute deutscher Abstammung ohne jüdische Vorfahren aus ihren Jobs geworfen werden. Meiner Meinung nach und nach der Meinung der meisten unpolitischen Offiziere ist es lebensnotwendig für uns, Deutschland jetzt als Pufferstaat gegen Russland aufzubauen. In der Tat fürchte ich, dass wir zu lange gewartet haben. Und in einem Brief spät in der Nacht an seine Frau: Ich kann Ihnen nicht die Wahrheit sagen, dass, wenn wir Deutschland nicht wiederherstellen, der Kommunismus auch Amerika übernehmen wird. George S. Patton Jr. starb am 21. Dezember 1945 in einem deutschen Krankenhaus in Heidelberg aufgrund von Komplikationen bei einem gebrochenen Hals, den er sich 11 Tage zuvor bei einem kleinen Autounfall zugezogen hatte. Es gab keinen offiziellen Bericht über den Vorfall und es hat keine Autopsie gegeben. Die Befunde der Obduktion bleiben bis zum heutigen Tage unter Verschluss. Pattons prophetische Warnungen blieben letztlich unbeachtet.